Hi everybody, I'm back. Apologies, another late one tonight. I clean forgot. It's been a lovely day. I've been out in the garden most of the day and clean forgot. However, I am going to read you from Walking on Cinders. This might be quite nice because this could be like a bedtime story now, this chapter, if you want to. And I have a glass of wine, so that probably makes it even better. Although whether I should have wine on my live Twitter feed, I don't know, but I do. So there we go. So I'm going to read from my book Walking on Cinders, again, as you know, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of this book. It came out May 2010 when I was 18 years old, and this is chapter 18. It was late, but Thomas found he couldn't sleep. He'd been awake for hours, lying on his bunk in an unfamiliar country, thinking only about the day ahead. For a while after they had first arrived at the bunkhouse, it had been almost impossible to sleep. Instead, they spoke in hushed whispers while the light bulb hummed and flickered. They discussed the evening's events, and Chris confided in his friend how worried he was about the task he'd been given, while Thomas mumbled sleepily in encouragement. Chris had eventually nodded off, but Thomas remained wide awake. Checking that other bunkhouse residents were sleeping soundly, he kicked the underside of the mattress above and hissed, "Chris, wake up!" A soldier in another bunk turned in his sleep, but didn't wake. Silently, Thomas watched as a pair of feet dangled over the edge of the bunk above, and Chris slid down the short metal ladder. "I'm awake now," he whispered, his feet padding to the ground, "but I'd prefer it if you never did that again. You've got big feet." "Where are you going?" Thomas asked, pulling the bedclothes away and getting up to stand beside his friend. He pulled on a dressing gown, tied it at the front, and looked Chris up and down. "I'm going for a walk," he replied, grabbing a thick sweater from his new kit on the table and putting it over his head. "I need some air." Thomas didn't even bother to answer as Chris opened the wooden door and headed off down the steps. He merely followed him out into the chill of the evening. Outside, they quickly saw that they were not alone. They had exited the bunkhouse into a central square surrounded by a cluster of other small buildings. Dotted all around them were other groups of 2 or 3 soldiers. Some were smoking, while others were talking quietly, the furthest deep in conversation. Chris wondered if this was a routine gathering or if the others were also unable to sleep. Did these men share his own worries? Were they fearful for their lives as he was, or the lives of their friends? Setting off with Thomas at his side, Chris began a circuit of the square. They passed the group of soldiers who were smoking lazily, and Thomas eyed them as Chris nodded in greeting before carrying on. Did they know he was their commanding officer? Or perhaps they were in the company to be led by Babineau? Before long, Chris had reached the far side of the courtyard. Thomas took a deep breath. "When do you think it's likely Ewan and Jennifer will arrive?" he asked. "It'll be good to see them again." "Sometime in the morning, I hope," Chris replied, stopping and turning back to his friend. Thomas nodded, surprised at this curt response. It was only when they were halfway back to the bunkhouse that they heard voices shouting from behind them. "Chris! Chris!" came a deep voice through the night. Chris turned on the spot to see a soldier they had passed moments before, and another, beckoning to them from the corner of the square. Reaching the pair, Chris thought them striking individuals indeed. Both wore the United uniforms. One was very short with brown hair, while the second, a man who had called, was well built with dark hair that may once have been styled into an afro, but now lay limp around his ears. "Alan Waldo," the man said, extending his hand in greeting, first to Chris and then to Thomas. "And this," he smiled, and patted his friend on the back, "is Brian Callowman." "Pleased to meet you," said the second. "He'll be our commanding officer in a few hours' time." "Good to meet you too," Chris replied, his mind struggling to compute information due to his lack of sleep. "And this is my good friend and comrade Thomas Fisher." The 2 soldiers smiled. "Oh, we know Private Fisher," Brian chuckled, slapping Thomas on the back. "We met him earlier today. Your friend has quite a personality." "Yes, that would be Thomas," Chris smiled. "What brings you out here in the middle of the night?" It was Thomas who had inquired, tired of people discussing him as if he wasn't there. Alan Waldo looked hard at the new arrivals. "When we can't sleep, we come out here to talk things over. Sometimes the guys have a kickabout, it takes our minds off things." The young soldier paused for a moment, and suddenly his jaw dropped, as if there was something important he had forgotten to say. "What is it?" Thomas asked, kicking the ground. Brian grimaced. "I'm sorry, we forgot. Commander Babineau was up here a little while ago. He asked us to come and find you." Chris shuddered at the thought of what his counterpart might want, and he kept him waiting. He was something about Dutail wanting to greet some friends of yours," he continued. "Said they'd arrived about an hour ago, and it was a chap and 3 girls." In this tired state, Chris's mind worked slowly. In fact, it was Thomas who asked first. "3 girls," he said. "Ewan was with Jennifer when we last saw him, so where did the other 2 come from?" Chris replied worriedly, "Do you know where they are, Alan?" Again the soldier smiled. "Babineau said they had all gone to the washrooms for a shower." The 2 soldiers stared at each other, thinking the same thing. "Where's that?" "Head back towards the courtyard and follow the signposts." Chris nodded and was about to leave when he grasped something. "You're both British, aren't you?" he asked, surprised that it hadn't dawned on him. "Indeed we are, Midlands born and raised," they both answered. Everyone smiled. "Good," Chris finished. Our French friends would be a little less tactful." They found the washroom easily enough. It was a long, plain building located not a great distance from their office base in the quad. In the darkness, Chris was beginning to develop a mental map of the complex. There were no soldiers out in this part of the barracks, perhaps because it was located further away from the bunkhouses, or they didn't want to risk being caught by Dutail. It was particularly exhilarating then for Thomas, who, for once, it looked like they were breaking the rules. "We'll take 1 each," Chris said simply. "Ewan will be in here somewhere." Thomas needed no further instruction. Inside, the shower rooms were damp and humid, with several cubicles and very little space to move. Thomas could hear the sound of running water, and as he turned to investigate, he almost walked straight into a pretty girl with auburn hair. She wore a simple blue dress, and her long hair was damp against her shoulders. She was tall and slender. "French," Thomas breathed as the girl began to talk. René, it would appear we have found our first soldier boy." Her accent was astonishing, deep and strong. The first girl smiled, and Thomas heard water stop, and then the catch on a door, before a second woman exited the furthest stall, a towel wrapped around her body, another holding her hair to her head. "Oh, Belle, you were right." This time the second girl smiled more perfectly than the first, and Thomas was suddenly conscious that he was looking at a pair of French twins. "Take him outside and wait for the others while I put on my clothes," she added before disappearing back into the stall. Outside again, the chill in the air hit sharp against Thomas's face. He knew he was blushing and was glad of the dark. Then he saw Chris had emerged from the opposite side with a very wet and bedraggled Jennifer, and Ewan, who appeared to be wearing stage clothes that barely fitted him. The look on his face said it all. "Well, we made it," he smiled, looking from Chris to Thomas. "It's good to see you both." "Care for an introduction?" Chris replied warily, his eyes first on the auburn girl in the blue dress, and then on another, so much like the first, as she emerged from the entrance beside them. "Oh, of course," Ewan smiled. "This is Belle Levette and her sister René. They're twins." "I can see that, Ewan. There is no game. You're probably not aware, but tomorrow we begin fighting against reformed forces. It's a dangerous operation, and there is a mountain of things that I need to explain to you and Thomas before dawn breaks." "Why so serious, soldier boy?" Belle giggled, walking towards Chris. "It sounds like fun." He took a few steps back and grimaced. In time, he might come to understand these French girls, but right now, to him, they were a danger. "It's serious. It's life and death, and I'll be leading the troops. Now, Jennifer," Chris looked at the singer, and she nodded politely, "I have to take Ewan and Thomas to discuss strategy. If I walk you girls to the Major General's office, will you be able to look after yourselves from there? I'm sure he's found beds for you, and in your case, Jennifer, it'll be safer." "Yes," she smiled, moving to stand between René and Belle. "That should be fine." As she passed by the soldier, she added it in her quietest whisper, "I'll have a word with them while we're there too." Chris smiled and realised just how much he had missed the company of the others. "Guys, please wait here," he warned, turning to address the other pair. "I won't be long." He was about to direct the girls when they were interrupted by another soldier. This time a soldier wore a dark uniform and several large badges were on his chest. It suggested he held a position of some importance. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said briskly, "but I've been instructed by Dutail's international leadership to search through the girls' belongings." His voice held the utmost sincerity. "But why on earth would you want to do that?" Belle asked in protest, suddenly pulling her own backpack behind her and away from the soldier's grasp. "I was about to ask the same question," Ewan interjected, looking the man up and down. He seemed genuine but had not yet stated his intentions. I'm afraid I'm just following orders, the soldier continued, moving a little closer to the grouping. If it's any consolation, it's primarily the singer's backpack that they wanted me to rummage through. Ewan pulled a strange face while Chris and Thomas watched with interest. Unbeknown to the twins, the others were putting on a highly elaborate show. As Chris had said just before they left the crash site, remain oblivious and act as if you know nothing at all. That way you will avoid almost all trouble. If he really needs to search my backpack, then I'm not going to stop him, Jennifer said suddenly. It was everyone else who had forgotten she was there. I mean, it's not like I've got anything to hide. Behind her, Chris nodded as she turned to wink at them from the corner of her eye. But does it really need to be done tonight? Chris queried, moving to address the new soldier face to face. I'm afraid so, he replied quickly, moving forward to stand directly beside Jennifer. Now, if you kindly hand over your bag. Gingerly, Jennifer reached behind her to grab the backpack which was propped up against the outer washroom wall. For at least 5 minutes, they watched in silence as the soldier tipped the contents of the backpack out onto the cold, hard concrete and examined each item in turn. Mainly, it was a mixture of her clothes, toiletries, and the empty food packets she and Ewan had consumed on their journey. But there was also sheets of music and lyrics in a thick pink folder, and it was only here that the soldier stopped suddenly, slowed in his examination, and looked at every object. Aha! He shouted, shuffling through a series of sheets. It appeared he had known all along what to look for. I knew it! But what on earth is that? Jennifer asked in mock surprise, as she watched the soldier stand up in full height and open a small black book. It was a joke in itself that this soldier didn't cotton on to their cover-up. I don't remember putting that in there. That's what they all say, the soldier replied in earnest, as his eyes moved backwards and forwards across an open page. This is just what we've been waiting for. Suddenly things were getting a little bit more serious. Just hold on a minute, Chris breathed deeply, moving in to stand directly behind the soldier. What exactly is it that you think you've found? The man before him merely laughed. Why, our secret documents, of course. Major General Sir Adam Dutale was informed days ago they would be transported alongside the force's sweetheart. So that's the reason they brought the jet down, Thomas questioned. Because Jennifer was holding some secret documents. It certainly seems that way, Chris replied almost immediately, now giving Jennifer a strange look. No, that can't be right, Ewan continued, moving to stand beside the girl he loved. Behind them, the French twins giggled with delight. Oh, Belle, I do love the gossip, Rennie smiled. For Chris, enough was enough. Whatever happened, he said, bringing to an end their conversation. I think it's about time I took the girls away and gave Jennifer some time to recover. She's obviously quite shocked. He was right. The force's sweetheart had turned as white as a sheet, again. Quickly, Chris paced from the group before signalling to the girls that they should follow along. Then, once they were together, he proceeded to inform the twins of the interesting deception. They giggled again, and Chris realised that they had pulled it off. They were free of the documents and the guilt that hung over them. It left their minds clear to concentrate on the impending battle. They talked as they walked, and soon they had disappeared. Following in the same direction was the soldier that carried the newly discovered documents. He did not wish to remain in what he believed was a compromising situation any longer than was necessary. I'm glad that's over, Corporal Ewan Roberts said, turning to face Thomas. Together they started to gather Jennifer's belongings, which were scattered across the ground. Well, at least we'll get rid of the documents now, his friend said, and you've learned that she can't remain an angel forever, which is probably quite a good thing. When Chris returned to his friends, he found them waiting impatiently. It had taken him far longer than he had hoped to introduce the girls to Dutale. There was a lot of explaining to do and questions to ask, many of which would have to wait for another day. Quickly they headed into the building, flicking the lights and closing the door behind them. The same musty smell remained, and the one large table still stood in the centre. Moving forwards and placing a pile of folded sheets there, which had been given to him by the Major General not 10 minutes earlier, Chris began to speak. Well, Ewan, how are we? It is good to be back together, is it not? Ewan could sense something sinister in his friend's voice, some kind of evil intent. Yeah, it's really good, he replied, knowing that his time as a leader was over. Chris was now in command again. In fact, it's pretty amazing, considering only days ago we were entangled in the wreckage of a United jet with little or no hope of survival. His hair was still wet across the forehead, and he looked innocent as the lights hummed above him. Well, that might be as it may, Chris continued, now noticing that Thomas was eyeing them both eagerly. You left the village when I had specifically told you not to." He was calm at the moment, yet his temper could rise at any time. "And you brought French twins along for the ride. They have no place here, Ewan. In a dangerous theatre of war?" His friend contemplated the fact, figuring in his own mind how best to reveal the truth. "It would have been just as dangerous if they had stayed in the village," he said simply. "Jennifer and I, we rescued them from their abusive father. We had no choice." There was silence for a moment. Chris played with the words in his head. Instinctively he knew that now there would be no need for anger, no need to use force. "Well then," he replied finally, placing his arms around his two friends and guiding them gently towards the table, "that is different." His voice had changed, and it was almost as if they were talking like they had always done. "Now," he began, reaching the papers that he had placed on the edge of the table, "Thomas has asked me to explain a few things." The young private nodded, before adding, "When we arrived here, Ewan, I was sent off with the other soldiers. Chris was taken away to meet the Major General, and he was given a position as a commanding officer for several companies." Ewan found it hard to believe. He had almost forgotten what it was like to be a real soldier. While he had been meeting and greeting girls and jumping between village barns with Jennifer, his friends had been preparing for war, and for a battle that was right on their doorstep. "You're going to have to explain all of this to me," he said worriedly, watching as Chris unfolded the largest piece of paper in the pile. "I'll make it quite simple, Ewan," his friend replied. "Listen carefully." Both Ewan and Thomas leaned in close, ears pricked, but they knew this information would be important. This is a holographic map of the Chain de Pews, the mountain range that you can see behind the barracks, and over the next few days, battles will be taking place not only here, but across the world in a strategic set of locations, in order to try and bring this war to a head. Chris watched as his friends nodded and looked down at the holographic map before them. It displayed a variety of marks and arrow directions on it. These marks show the locations in which Major General Dutail will want us to position our men. We will be taking supplies with us, and because I will be commanding 4 companies of men, I will be marching each to a separate location, with secondary officers then taking control, the 3 of us remaining together and fighting with H Company. He took a deep breath before adding, "At least, that's what Dutail told me when he handed me the papers. You may also wish to know that I've been given the non-commissioned rank of Capitan. That's because on paper, I have to be at a certain level before I can lead a company of men." Ewan's face fell, as he too appeared to realise the difficult situation which the Major General had put Chris in. "It won't affect the way we look at you," Ewan said, "but you'll get a lot of animosity over it." Thomas nodded, and Chris was glad of their understanding. "But why you? Why Capitan Aston? Why not a leading French officer?" Chris smiled and chuckled to himself. "Oh, believe me, Ewan, there is an egotistical French commandant in charge of 4 other companies. And to answer your second question, I feel we are simply part of a larger plan. You see, Major General Dutail told me that he and his officials have been studying and tracking our dear old friend, Colonel Smith, for some time. It would appear that he is up to no good. I don't know what he's been doing, but it appears that when Dutail asked for 3 British soldiers to be deployed to the Chain de Pews in order to lead a new and dangerous offensive, Colonel Smith saw it as a chance to be rid of his 3 very experienced men. The latest revelation was shocking for everyone, and they found it hard to comprehend." "Hold on a moment," Thomas asked, trying to remember back to the night before their deployment. Colonel Smith told us that the President had asked for us specifically." The look on his face was one of confusion. "I feel it was merely a ruse and a ploy. It was used to convince us to sign on the dotted line," Chris said meekly. "But that must mean the Major General—" Ewan struggled over his words. "Exactly," Chris smiled, breaking his friend off mid-sentence. "The Major General has been following us for some time now, and personally that is the only proof I need to convince me that we are far safer here than we would ever have been back in London." The others nodded. "I also believe that it would be quite beneficial for us to do some planning before morning." For some time following their conversation, they stood around the table discussing how the day would pan out. Of course, they had been through these motions many times before back in London, but these had been merely hypothetical. This time it was real and far more serious. The holographic maps that Dutail had provided for them were in-depth and detailed, showing not only the terrain of the Chain de Pews, the locations where the French government believed the reformed troops would attack first, and the slightest rocky outcrop that might provide cover during a face-to-face battle, but even direct routes back to the barracks through great areas of open scrubland with only trees for cover. These were escape routes if they ever needed them. Chris soon developed an expert skill in planning and preparation. Early the previous day, he had been worried about the offensive, but now it appeared that Dutail had provided him with a fully formed plan, and all he had to do was implement it. As the 3 British soldiers continued to discuss tactics within the small damp room, the sun began to rise above the mountains, and the 800 soldiers who had spent their last night in comfort began to rise and prepare themselves for deployment into the field. Inside, Chris, Ewan and Thomas had no way of measuring the passage of time, and so they were quite surprised when there was a knock at the door and a gentle hum of expectant excitement began to rise from outside. Thomas was the first to reach the door, opening it wide to see a somewhat fraught Jennifer standing on the steps, surrounded by an ever-expanding group of soldiers and looking expectantly into the little room. "Miss Marmalade, we love you!" was the shouts came echoing from the crowd. "Sing for us, Miss Marmalade, we love you!" Thomas looked on in surprise and grinned, as he remembered they really were friends with one of the most influential women in the world. His warning the previous day had paid off. "Chris, Ewan," he called, "I think you'd better see this." Quickly, the men raced over and looked upon a scene of complete infatuation. Jennifer was dressed in a short, flowing, flowery dress. Chris knew it did not belong to her. "It appears they have recognised you as the Force's sweetheart," he said weakly. "I did wonder how long it would take." "Yes," Jennifer replied, timidly looking around. "I'm really not used to all this attention. My manager normally deals with this, not me." She smiled, and suddenly her face fell. "But it will only get worse. The Major General said that Renee, Bell and I are to be nurses. We're going to look after any injured soldiers out in the field." Chris approved. He knew Dutail had a sensible head on his shoulders, and this task would surely keep the girls away from any further trouble. "Inside. Now," he added finally, as Ewan ushered Jennifer into the small room. Then he raced to push the door shut behind them as men surged forwards. He was just about to close it completely when he saw a familiar figure approaching through the crowd. The soldiers backed away quickly as their Major General paced forwards towards the doorway. Immediately it was open again and Dutail was speaking. "Chris, I didn't think you would take this long," he said, all of a fluster, not himself at all. "Things are beginning, Chris. The time is nigh. I've taken your friends to the hospital wing, and now I must lead you to your men, Capitaine Aston. Bring the others with you, and I will deal with these." He gestured towards the crowd of angry men, which by now was slowly dispersing, and Chris barely had time to gather his thoughts before they were out of the little building, down the steps, and off to meet their destiny. "Men," Dutail roared, and those who still remained, hoping to get another glimpse of their idol, "to your companies at once!" The soldiers began to run in every direction, and Chris smiled to himself. For that moment he knew that with Dutail he would always be safe. "Oh, Miss Marmalade," the Major General said, surprised, as he turned around and found himself eye to eye with the beautiful woman. I mean, Jennifer. What are you doing here? Off to the hospital wing with you, now." Managing quickly to kiss Ewan on the cheek and wave to her friends, Jennifer headed off to reunite herself with Rennie and Belle, shouting until she was out of sight. "Keep yourself safe. I'll be thinking of you. Don't let them get into danger, Chris. I know you'll be a great leader." Even Chris felt the tug at his heartstrings as the Force's sweetheart finally disappeared, and Ewan's heart dropped from his chest. This was it. There was no going back now. "Now then," Dutail said finally, marking the end of it all. "Chris, Ewan and Thomas, come with me." And silently, the 3 men walked with the Major General towards the waiting soldiers. So that's chapter 18 of Walking on Cinders. Really hope you enjoyed it this evening. Quite a nice way to end the evening with a little glass of wine as well. So I will be back tomorrow, hopefully at 6 p.m, for Easter Sunday, and we'll read chapter 19 as the battle will begin. Perhaps not the best topic for an Easter Sunday, but hey, there we go. I'll see you back here tomorrow for the next chapter.